Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And if you follow modern comic books for any length of time, you're bound to encounter stories about dead characters coming back to life. Hell, it's gotten to a point now where it's practically a meme. Death in comic books has just become so trivial that it often fails to have much impact. These days, whenever a character dies, most fans just shrug it off, assuming they'll come back eventually. And, with very few exceptions, they're often right. The list of dead characters who haven't come back is remarkably short. Now, I certainly have my opinions about this phenomenon. Character deaths weren't always this meaningless in comics. But I'd rather not bemoan that. Instead, I want to highlight and even celebrate a very special comic that handled death and resurrection perfectly. That comic is Phoenix Resurrection, The Return of Jean Grey. And in terms of making death and rebirth matter, this is the comic by which I measure all others. Now, full disclosure, I'm a big Jean Grey fan on top of being a big X-Men fan in general. So expect my bias to show a lot in this video. Expect me to gush lovingly about a story that brought back one of my favorite characters. And I make no apologies for this. I'm simply warning everyone to expect more fanboying than usual. Having gotten that out of the way, I'll need to provide some big picture context, because a big part of what made Phoenix Resurrection so impactful wasn't just the fact that it brought Jean Grey back to life. What made it matter so much was that it did so under circumstances that made her return truly special. You see, Jean Grey has died and come back to life before. In fact, when it comes to death and resurrection, she's often the Marvel character most associated with that trope, and for good reason. Back in the early 1980s, she was the central character to the original Phoenix saga, which still ranks as one of the most iconic stories in Marvel Comics history. In that story, Jean became imbued with the cosmic power of the Phoenix Force, a powerful entity capable of destroying planets and recreating them. The power was so great that she eventually lost control. With it, she famously destroyed a planet with 5 billion alien beings on it, an act that would go on to become an integral part of her story. And that story famously ended with Jean tragically and heroically sacrificing herself to save her friends. At the time, that was a big deal. Back then, major characters weren't regularly killed off and resurrected. It just wasn't a thing. So, Jean's death did carry quite a bit of weight at the time. And it led to some major upheavals in the X-Men comics, both on the pages and within the creative team. Ultimately, Jean Grey would return back to life in the pages of Fantastic Four. In fact, she didn't stay dead for more than 6 years, which did not sit well with writers like Chris Claremont. Now, I'd rather not get into the reasons why that was such an issue, but all you need to know is that Jean dying and coming back to life is not unprecedented. In fact, given her connection to a power like the Phoenix Force, it's very much in keeping with the classical mythology of the Phoenix, a being that dies and is reborn from its own ashes. But it was Jean's second death in 2004 that really set the stage for Phoenix Resurrection. It unfolded in the pages of New X-Men 150, which was near the end of the critically acclaimed run by Grant Morrison. While it might not have been as iconic as Jean's death in the Phoenix saga, this one still hit really hard. There was a lot of drama leading up to it. Jean was starting to show signs of the Phoenix Force again. She was also dealing with some major melodrama between her, Cyclops, Emma Frost, and Wolverine. Seriously, I cannot overstate how many shipping wars erupted over that. But it all culminated with Jean's death. It turned this deeply personal struggle into the ultimate tragedy, one that would have led to the destruction of the entire timeline had Jean not made one last sacrifice as the Phoenix. It was a powerful moment, one many X-Men fans would go on to cite for years to come. But it also marked the last time Jean Grey would be a live presence for the X-Men for years to come. Yes, her impact would still be felt, and yes, her presence would continue to loom large. At one point, Wolverine even named a school after her. But from 2004 until late 2017, when Phoenix Resurrection came out, Jean Grey was officially dead. And this time, Marvel seemed intent on keeping her dead, something that became a major point of contention among many fans. It really was an odd hill for Marvel to defend, keeping Jean Grey dead despite her history of death and resurrection with the Phoenix Force. And a big part of what made it so annoying was that during this interim period, a great many major characters died and came back to life. Captain America famously died after the events of Civil War, but came back just a few years later. Hawkeye died at the hands of the Scarlet Witch in 2004, but came back shortly after the events of House of M. Psylocke and Colossus, two characters who had been dead before Jean, also returned in the mid-2000s. And even Nightcrawler was tragically killed in the events of Second Coming in 2010, but went on to come back to life in the pages of Amazing X-Men in 2014. Now keep in mind, these are all characters not known for coming back from the dead, and none of them had the resurrecting power of the Phoenix Force. But still, they all died and come back, yet Jean Grey remained dead? It was definitely a strange and deeply frustrating detail. What made it even worse was that Marvel frequently teased Jean's return during this period. When the mutant messiah Hope Summers was born, her uncanny resemblance to Jean Grey did not go unnoticed. At one point, there was even a fake cover of Astonishing X-Men hinting that she was about to return. And other events like Phoenix Endsong and Avengers vs. X-Men built entire stories around the Phoenix Force, but did not bring Jean back in any capacity. Eventually, Marvel did bring her back in a limited capacity in 2012. That's when writer Brian Michael Bendis had the original 5 X-Men time travel to the future as teenagers, including a young Jean Grey. And for a number of years, she was a major part of the X-Men comics. And while seeing a teenage, time-displaced Jean Grey was fun and all, she was still clearly not the Jean Grey that died in 2004. And she was not the Jean whose absence was so clearly felt in so many X-Men stories. But it's that same absence that helped create the ideal circumstances for Phoenix Resurrection. More than anything else, the young teenage Jean Grey reminded us why Jean is so important to the X-Men. Charles Xavier may be the dreamer, Cyclops may be the leader, Wolverine might be the warrior, but Jean Grey is and always has been the X-Men's heart. And without that heart, the X-Men just aren't the same. For years and years after her death, it felt like there was this never-ending effort to fill the hole she'd left behind. Emma Frost became the X-Men's top telepath, as well as Cyclops' main love interest. But even on panel, Emma often noted how she was always compared to Jean. And whenever anyone brought her up, it was always with a sense of longing, knowing that she made everyone around her better. She really did bring out the best in people. And, not coincidentally, characters like Charles Xavier and Cyclops went down much darker paths in her absence. They went on to make choices they probably would not have made had Jean Grey been around. It happened so often that, with each passing year, Jean's absence had a cumulative effect. But then Phoenix Resurrection comes along. And finally, the heart that has been missing from the X-Men returns. Now, I know that was a bit long-winded explaining the history of the X-Men comics before this story, but that history is critical to appreciate how this story played out and why it was so satisfying. It begins with a series of strange psychic anomalies. All over the world, there are these manifestations of familiar teammates and enemies reappearing. But when the X-Men go to investigate, they discover that they're not real. Yes, they can fight them, they can hurt them, but they seem to have no sentience, no motivation. They just appear and disappear on a whim. Now, there aren't many psychic forces that can cause something like this, but Jean Grey is one of them. Initially, that seems unthinkable, and that's a strong sentiment. It's as though the characters and the readers are on the same page here. Jean has just been dead for so long. Why would she suddenly return now? It's the first instance of the characters in the story aligning their emotions with us, the readers, but trust me, it is not the last. While the X-Men are investigating this, we're introduced to this strange, dreamlike world. In it, we see Jean Grey. We see her living a seemingly normal life. She has no powers, she has no memories of being with the X-Men, but near as we can tell, she looks and carries herself just like the Jean who died in New X-Men 150. We don't know for sure if this is the real her or what's behind all this, but just seeing her alive again, it's powerful. And if you'd been following X-Men comics in the years leading up to this, you'd be forgiven for thinking this is just another fake out, another false alarm that Marvel really was bringing Jean back. But this time, it's real. This time, it's the real flesh and blood Jean Grey that we've known, loved, and missed for so long. But does she even remember? This is where Phoenix Resurrection takes some more dramatic turns. Because after the X-Men trace the source of the anomalies, they're led to this strange bubble world in the deserts of New Mexico. And no, that location isn't random. If you've read the original Phoenix saga, you know why that area holds so much meaning to Jean, as well as the Phoenix Force. Because once everyone knows the source, it becomes clear. Not only is Jean Grey back, the Phoenix Force is back as well. Now, during the same time in the comics, the Phoenix Force was part of some other major subplots, most notably in the Thor comics. Being a force of destruction and resurrection, it was always bound to make its presence felt again. But this time, it did so in a way that was more personal. This time, it didn't just seek out a new host or target. It sought out the most important host, the one with which it had the greatest connection. Because the Phoenix Force had found many hosts during Jean's absence, including multiple X-Men. But no matter who it imbued its power with, it never matched the bond it had with Jean. And the results were often destructive, both for the Phoenix itself and those it possessed. Creating this world, bringing Jean back, it comes off as this elaborate way to regain that connection. The Phoenix is just so desperate for the real, true Jean, not like so many fans were at the time, even those who appreciated Jean's time-displaced self. But in creating this world for Jean, even filling it with a host of other dead X-Men, it's hurting her, it's manipulating her. It's also causing chaos and destruction beyond this idyllic realm, which is often an unavoidable side effect of cosmic power. And it's now on the X-Men to stop it. But that means freeing Jean from this dreamlike world and potentially triggering the Phoenix's darker inclinations. How they go about this is dramatic to say the least, and even a bit reckless. The X-Men know better than anyone what happens when Jean and the Phoenix become unstable. We, the audience, know as well, but they still take that chance, and we want to cheer them on. It creates a special kind of dramatic tension. Even if you didn't know whether this would bring Jean back permanently, there's real emotional weight to this moment. There's a sense that, after all this time, the baggage from the Phoenix Force is still there. We can't get around it any more than Jean. If she is to live again, she and the X-Men must confront it, but not in the way they've done so in the past. It all comes to a head when the Phoenix is truly awakened. This dreamlike world fades and Jean suddenly remembers everything. And as a result, the Phoenix returns to claim her. It sets the stage for another confrontation between the X-Men and the Phoenix, as well as another inner struggle between the Phoenix and Jean. At first, the Phoenix pulls no punches. It makes clear that it wants Jean to be its host again. It wants to recapture that same feeling it had when they first met. But Jean does not want that. The X-Men don't want that. They're all fighting with her to resist this outcome, this fate that they know can only lead to destruction. Then, in one of the most dramatic moments of the story, the Phoenix plays one final card. It brings Cyclops back into the fold. Now, at the time, Cyclops, the adult version at least, was dead. He'd been the first victim of Mpox, the deadly disease caused by the Terrigen mists. And as Jean Grey's greatest love, he played a major role in Jean's actions during the original Phoenix saga. Bringing him back in this case was one last push, one final attempt by the Phoenix to tempt Jean into embracing it. The moment that unfolds is, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest, most heartfelt exchanges in the history of X-Men comics. Jean gets to share a moment with her husband, a moment they never got to share the first or second time she died. They hold each other. They reaffirm the love they shared, the love that helped make them one of the most endearing romances in the history of Marvel Comics. But even though the Phoenix is giving them a chance to take it all back, Jean rejects it. In a moment of will, love, and undeniable heart, she rejects this power and the price that comes with it. It forces her to lose the man she loves all over again. It forces her to say goodbye to the Phoenix Force, convincing it that they cannot continue like this, always trying to recapture their former connection. She must let it go, and the Phoenix must let her go as well. It's genuinely painful for her, and it's painful for the Phoenix Force as well. In the end, the Phoenix Force honors her wishes and leaves her. But Jean still remains. She's still there, alive, well, and with all her memories intact. And in that final moment, the X-Men and the audience by default allow themselves to rejoice. They allow themselves to embrace her and accept the fact that this is real. Jean Grey is back. They all missed her so much. We did too. They all felt the agony of her absence. We did too. It's a perfect instance of the emotions of the characters mirroring those of the audience. And that, more than anything, is what made Phoenix Resurrection work. Not just as a story, but as a case study in how to make death and resurrection matter. These feelings just wouldn't have been possible if Jean had been kept dead for so long. They also wouldn't have worked if she'd been brought back through some other means, be it time travel, a warping of reality, or a sudden revelation. This story went for an approach that maximized the emotional depth and dramatic weight of it all. It built on the legacy that Chris Claremont started with the original Phoenix saga, and drew inspiration from all the ways the mythos has evolved ever since. The end result was a story that epitomized why Jean Grey is such an endearing character, as well as why she matters so much to the X-Men as a whole. Even at a time when major characters die and come back to life all the time, her return still stood out. Her coming back to life brought true, unambiguous catharsis. And the world of X-Men and Marvel Comics is better because of it. A lot subsequently happens to Jean in the X-Men after her return. And I don't doubt that her story will continue to evolve. But whatever happens with her, the events of Phoenix Resurrection will always be a defining moment in that story. It showed just how impactful her presence was for the X-Men and the Marvel Universe. For that reason, and so many others, Phoenix Resurrection will always be a truly special comic, for me and for so many other fans. Because it didn't just tell the story of how Jean Grey came back to life. It told the story of how the true heart of the X-Men finally returned. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.